The village of Avdiivka in eastern Ukraine is hanging by a thread and could fall within days. It's hard to imagine it can hang on much longer than a week, maybe two at the outside, but there's no more point in holding on to that city. It should have been let go long ago. I know there was a lot of issues within the Ukrainian high command about whether they should have withdrawn to other positions earlier, but they didn't do it. And so now then the bottom line is that city is on the verge of collapse. Even the U.S. Is willing to admit this when John Kirby said this just yesterday.
Fighting is incredibly intense in the east, particularly in a city called Avdiivka. It's a city that we've talked about several times before. Unfortunately, we're getting reports from the Ukrainians that the situation is critical, with the Russians continuing to press Ukrainian positions every single day. Avdiivka is at risk of falling into Russian control. In very large part, this is happening because the Ukrainian forces on the ground are running out of artillery ammunition. Russia is sending wave after wave of conscript forces to attack Ukrainian positions, and because Congress has yet to pass the supplemental bill, we've not been able to provide Ukraine with the artillery shells that they desperately need to disrupt these Russian assaults.
Now, what you're seeing there, and you're about to see in some clips to follow, is a continuation of the disconnect from reality. John Kirby is saying almost directly there, not even implying, that the only reason Ukraine is losing Avdiivka is because the U.S. Congress didn't pass a budget or a bill that would have allowed more money to go to Ukraine. So it's really just about the cash. That's what he says. It's no truth to that at all, as I'm going to show you in a little bit more detail here shortly. But actually, Kirby isn't the worst offender of that. You actually had Jens Stoltenberg, the NATO, not Supreme Commander, the Secretary General of NATO, the guy who's supposed to be in charge of all this politically and leading the way to show what we can do and how strong we are, said this about the situation.
I welcome that NATO allies are providing more support, more air defense, more ammunition. I welcome the decision by the European Union to allocate 50 billion euros to Ukraine. And I expect the US Congress to agree a package of continued support to Ukraine, because supporting Ukraine is not charity. Supporting Ukraine is an investment in our own security.
Okay, we'll take that to the last point first. It is not charity, he says, but it's actually something, an investment in our national security, that we must provide these funds for Ukraine so that they can hold fast. That's not true. It's absolutely inaccurate. Our security is not at threat. European security is not at risk. It bears repeating. Russia, after we're now just about to the 2-year mark of this war, about to begin the 3rd year, Russia is in full-on war with their neighbor, and to date, they still only have about 15 to 17% of the territory that Ukraine once held. So you're going to try and make this statement that our security in the West, a 32-member alliance, is at risk because Russia may someday take more than 17% of the one country on their border with no allies, no Air Force, and no Navy. And that's the threat you want to try to say that we must provide to Ukraine. No, you know what? Actually, the best thing that we could do for our national security, if that was truly the objective, it would be, let's negotiate a peace or a cessation of hostilities, anything to stop the fighting, because that's what's going to help the West. That's what's going to lower the chance of even accidental escalation, whether it's, a missile straying across the border somewhere, or God forbid, some crazy thing should happen and somebody makes a stupid decision and it escalates into nuclear warfare. That's where the catastrophic nature could come from. At the moment, that risk is much lower than it was earlier in the war, but you can't rule it out. But the best way to eliminate it is to have a negotiated settlement. But that's not what we're doing. That's not what the NATO is even thinking about doing. Instead, he, first of all, brags on the fact that they just got $50 billion allocated by the European Union. What he didn't tell you is that $50 billion is for 4 years, and that money is almost all going administratively to try and keep the Ukrainian government afloat, to keep their teachers paid, to keep the trucks operating within the country, just to keep the infrastructure going. What he also didn't tell you is that that's about a quarter of the need. to keep the country just running. So it's unclear how Ukraine is going to continue going even through the remainder of this year, much less into the future, if they only have about 25% of the money they need just to function, which is coming from Europe. The other thing he says, we expect that the Congress, the U.S. Congress, is going to provide other money, $60 billion for just this 1 year. That's at least more what they're trying to get done. But I'm not sure that that's a real safe bet, because the U.S. Senate passed a bill last week that would have provided for $60 billion for Ukraine. But the House of Representatives, which has to pass its version of that budget for a bill to make the money actually available, is not quite on board with that. And the Speaker of the House, in the result of that bill, had this to say.
The American people are with us on this issue. I mean, they are with us because they understand you have to actually solve the problem. And the product that was produced by the Senate did not solve the problem. You've all heard us hammer over and over H.R. 2, right? That was our signature piece of legislation that we passed many, many months ago, last year. And the reason that all those components are important, again, is because they have to fit together. That's got to solve the problem. You have to address all of them. The Senate bill didn't do that, and that's why it was rejected over there. We have to do it. It's been mentioned that I've been requesting a meeting with the president for weeks now, a month. I've been asking to sit down with the president to talk about the border and talk about national security, and that meeting has not been granted.
No, sorry, I didn't set that up properly. What he's saying, that's not included in the Senate bill. He's talking about border security, because the way the White House characterized this bill and the Senate characterized this bill was it was a big national security bill that's going to help America. But for some reason, even though it's the number one issue right now among American voters, the border issue, the crisis going on down there, the Senate bill inexplicably took it out. So it wasn't even part of the deal. The House of Representatives, on the other hand, has said from the outset, as he mentioned there, that they want the border to be part of that deal. And in fact, if the border has to be first, then he can talk about other things separately. But when someone went back and asked the leader in the Senate, Chuck Schumer, if he would consider, like in negotiations with the House, to actually add the border back in there, he said this.
Are you ruling out adding any border security language to this bill, either through amendment in the House or conference negotiation? Are you ruling out adding any new?
The bottom line is, this bill passed with a robust majority. We need to get aid to Ukraine quickly. We cannot dither for another 3-4 months. And the quickest and best way to do it is pass the Senate bill.
So you see, he's like, no, I want my version to go, so I'm not willing to negotiate with the other chamber. That the House representatives is saying, no, I want this version of the bill to go up, or we're not going to pass anything at all. So they're at a definite loggerheads. The bottom line is that Stoltenberg is wrong to have confidence that the House of Representatives or that the U.S. Congress is going to provide $60 billion to Ukraine. So that alone by itself shows that there are serious problems going on in the Ukraine side. But look, let me reiterate here. It's not cash that's the problem for Ukraine. It's the comprehensive deal. It's a comprehensive way combat power is created and how wars are sustained over time. You can't just get a bunch of cash and say, yeah, we need this money here. You've got to have enough artillery shells. You have to have enough artillery cannons. You have to have tanks, armored personnel carriers, air defense systems, ammunition for that, the interceptor missiles. You have to have spare parts for all of these things here. And at the top of that list, you have to have personnel. You have to have adequately trained people. And there's been lots of reports out in recent days that Russia has been suffering huge casualties in their attacks, both in Avdiivka and elsewhere, which I'll talk about in just a second in more detail. And it's probably true. It's hard to know, to gauge what the accurate numbers are, but it stands to reason it's pretty high. The problem is it's at least equal, if not higher, on the Ukraine side. But Russia has millions more men from which to draw. Russia is their whole society is full on in support of this war, which means at this point, Russia has only done a single mobilization, which was in the fall of 2022, and none since, because they have people who are signing up, who literally volunteer to go fight, that they don't have to do any forced mobilizations. Ukraine left that behind long ago, and now they are doing forced mobilizations to try and compel people to go to the front line. And if you saw our earlier show today, where we interviewed Matt Van Dyke, who has spent some time on the front lines in Ukraine and was live to us from Kiev itself. He says, look, it's a problem because the quality of the people coming forward already is substandard, not what it used to be in the earlier days, because a lot of those people have been killed. So this new batch is not going to make it. So literally everywhere you want to look, whether it is the cash, because it's now just a trickle of what it was, or the manpower, everything is tilted in Russia's favor. And that's especially at the case in Avdiivka. So despite all the things that the NATO commander is saying, despite what John Kirby is saying here, none of these things have changed the fact on the battlefield. And let me show you just a clip from one of our show's favorites and go-to sources. Alex from History Legends, just hours before this broadcast, released this video.
As we're speaking, the battle is clearly lost. Hundreds of Ukrainians are desperately trying to escape the encirclement by any means possible, but thousands are definitely trapped. Since my last video on Avdiivka, within a week, detachments of the Russian Guards and the Russian Volunteer Corps have made all these gains.
And it's much worse than that. When the Ukraine President Zelensky fired his commander-in-chief, Zaluzhny, they hired a guy named Syrsky, General Syrsky, who's been around for a long time. One of his first actions was to send reinforcements to Avdiivka, the 3rd Assault Brigade of the Azov group. And there was expectation that he would slow down that loss of Avdiivka. But because of this extraordinary mud that's been going on in the area, many of those troops were bogged down and were not even able to get to the front lines. And when they get bogged down, they're easy prey for Russian drones or Russian artillery or Russian missile strikes. So they have not been able to get there. And in fact, they're now then primarily putting themselves in a position on the northwestern part of Avdiivka, basically to act as a blocking to try and get some of the other troops out, which ironically is angering the Azov battalion group, because they're an assault group, so they want to go and attack the Russians, and instead they're basically manning static lines to try and hold off the Russian attack so that others can escape. But the bottom line is that this battle is just almost over. It's essentially irreversible at this point, and like I said, it could be days, just mere days before it finally falls. The problem for Ukraine is it's not just this one battle. As the Institute for the Study of War has shown, there's this map here. These are the three main areas, and all of these green circles are places where the Russians are advancing. So on the left, you have the northern part there, the Kupiansk area, and Russians are moving forward. If you look closely, you can see orange there, which shows the advances the Russians are making. It looks incremental, but it's only moving to the east, to the west. It's not moving in the other direction. So Ukraine continues to back off. You have in the center there, the Bakhmut area, where virtually everything that Ukraine gained over the end of their summer offensive has now been lost. And so now Russia is on the verge of moving forward into areas that they had never gained before, even in that area. On the right, you see in the big circle at the top, that's Avdiivka, but you see all the other circles underneath that shows all along the line of contact. And put together, all three of these pictures are somewhere around 600 kilometers. Everywhere you look, the Ukraine side is advancing, and the Russian side is advancing against the Ukrainians, and they are unable to stop them. They no longer have the reserves that they had in the winter, in the summer offensive. They don't have the manpower even to backfill some of these losses that are going. So the Syrsky, no matter who's in command, he doesn't have the ability to move people from one place to another as he tried to do during as his forces tried to do in the summer. Now then, they've lost so many. They spent so much time in Avdiivka, and they now have potentially thousands of troops that are going to be surrounded and may either be captured or have to surrender, or they may be killed if they don't surrender. And then there's some evidence that they may choose that path as well. But the bottom line is that they've lost it. So that's even less of an opportunity that the commander of the Ukraine forces has to move troops around to try and stop these Russian advances on all these different fronts. In context to all of that, in light of all of those things that are known, these are open source information. Anyone with a willingness to go look can see them. And I'm laying it out here for you in context so you see it. Despite that, you have the NATO Secretary General adding how confident he is and where this is going.
We see that our support is making a difference on the battlefield every day. Just yesterday, the Ukrainians were able to strike successfully a Russian naval ship. And this demonstrates the skills and the competence of the Ukrainian armed forces.
I mean, that's just sheer myth. This doesn't demonstrate anything. And it's true. And let me be clear on that. The Ukraine side has made tremendous progress throughout the war, and by some accounts has destroyed up to a third of Russia's Black Sea fleet, even though the Ukrainian side doesn't even have an effective navy. They've used these drone boats. They've used some missile fire. They've been very creative in what they've done. And it is no kidding. They have knocked out a substantial portion of the Russian Black Sea fleet. But that doesn't have any impact on the ground. So that's not going to help them in Avdiivka. It's not going to help them west of Bakhmut. It's not going to help them down in the Dnipro River area. All of those places, they're continuing to lose ground. So all these kind of big splashy events where there was another large Russian ship that was sunk just a couple of days ago or badly damaged. I mean, that's great for morale. It makes you feel better for the moment, but it doesn't change anything on the ground because the Black Sea Fleet is not crucial for what happens on the ground. That's when the Russian army is at, and that's what you have to stop. If you can't stop the army, you're not going to. Now, there are some claims among the Ukrainian side and supporters of it that if they get this money, if the Congress comes up with the $60 billion, then they're going to be able to mount, and with those mobilization that they're trying to get done here, that by the summer, maybe they can mount another offensive and succeed where they failed. Let me just tell you from a military perspective, that is complete nonsense. The reason that the summer offensive failed last year was not for a lack of capability and weapon systems. It was for the lack of the capacity of the Ukrainian armed forces to be able to conduct this operations necessary to unseat a dug-in enemy defense. And by the way, Russia has still all of those defensive lines, which were only one places where it's even tested. Those have been repaired. The other ones have been deepened. The task for Ukraine in the next summer would be tremendously higher than it was here, but they still won't have any air defense capabilities that in the numbers that they need. They still won't have the air capability, even if they get the F-16s. And let me specifically address that, because some people claim if we get the F-16s, then all of a sudden now it's going to change the dynamics. It won't. It will provide some utility, but we use F-16s in conjunction with a system of air defense, air offense, AWACS planes, and all this. All these things are in a system that allows those aircraft to be effective in our system. Ukraine doesn't have that. They just have the pilots, and they're not even fully trained yet. So they'll be going in with hardly any experience. So the idea that the S-400 on the Russian side won't be able to knock those down, it might be a wee bit harder than the MiG-29s that they have, but maybe not, because the Russian air defense is very powerful and capable. It's not perfect. It's not as good as ours even, but it can definitely take those out. So it's not going to make any difference whether they have air or not. They also still don't have mine-breaching equipment, without which you can't even talk about having another offensive. Those things simply don't exist in number. And look, let me point out one other thing. This, for some reason, it's not talked about, even though it's critical to this. If the Ukraine side even has the fantasy of launching an offensive in the summer, they're going to have a whole new batch of armored vehicles. They're going to have hundreds of tanks, new tanks. I'm talking about additional, because so many were lost in the last one. They're going to have armored personnel carriers, new howitzers, additional howitzers, certainly millions of more artillery shells. And they're going to have air defense capabilities and interceptor missiles in numbers that they haven't had. And they're going to have huge engineering support, which is for mine clearing equipment. If you don't have all of that, there isn't even the fantasy hope that they could succeed offensively. And folks, when was the last time you even heard a report that some Western nation was ready to give hundreds of armored vehicles to Ukraine? It's not even about the cash. No one has them. No one has the amount of armor that would be necessary to give to Ukraine from the West. It's not even on the table. So it doesn't matter if the Congress supports this with ends up passing some bill. Maybe they still will. I don't know if they will or not. I think it's a 50-50 proposition at this point, but maybe they do. If they do, it won't matter because nobody in Congress is talking about sending over, like a division's worth of M1 tanks or another 200 or 300 Bradley fighting vehicles or several hundred artillery pieces, self-propelled or towed. Nobody from the Western Europe is talking about doing those things either. Have you heard anything about a British Challenger tank or any more German Leopards? You haven't heard them. Nobody's talking about them because no one has them left to give. We ourselves gave 5,000 total military vehicles to include trucks and armor in the first year and a half of this war. Other countries have given a lot too. They just don't have that much spare capacity. So there is no way you want to look at this financially, militarily, diplomatically, tactically, or personnel that Ukraine has any chance to continue on with this. But you see, whether it's Kirby, whether it's Stoltenberg, whether it's like General Ben Hodges, all these people keep claiming that if they just get one more thing, Hodges is famous for saying they need long-range missile systems, that somehow that's going to make a difference. It's not going to. They had plenty of missiles. They didn't get our ATACMS earlier on, but they did get a German and British long-range missiles, and they had some tactical effect. But it didn't tilt anything operationally, much less strategically. And it won't end because we don't have that many more to give. Do you understand that? Right now, the U.S. is on a significant buildup program to try to produce more artillery shells, more missile interceptors, et cetera. But it's going to take years for that to actually produce anything. Ukraine doesn't have years. Avdiivka may have days left. And these other fronts once that one falls, then the morale is already going to be weakened because they know that they lost their commander that they lacked. The second guy doesn't have a really great reputation, Syrskyi. There's division a lot of political division between the leaders, the political leaders and the military leaders. And they see that they're not getting, the U.S. Congress is not coming up. And even if they do, it's going to be a little bit. No one's talking about equipment. You understand this. From the perspective of the Ukrainian fighters, you can see where their morale to continue throwing themselves into battles that can't be won is going to continue to deteriorate. We fool ourselves if we think that they'll never break. That nope, they are motivated and they care about their country, unquestioned. I absolutely do not question their love of country. They have demonstrated that for 2 years under incredible odds. But instead of just patting them on the back and saying, yay, good job, you guys, I'm proud of you, don't throw them into a situation to where they may end up psychologically breaking because of so many pressures against them and so many negative things, while at the same time, because the other half of that equation you also have to consider is that the Russian side are gaining across the board. Vladimir Putin is as confident as he has been since before the war started, when he thought he had a strong military. Now they've made a lot of corrections, and he does have a more powerful military. Even if he doesn't use it good for combined arms operations, you saw that map I put up from the Institute for the Study of War. He's pushing on the entire front line. You see everywhere that Russians are on the advance to the west. The Ukraine side doesn't even have the capacity to go on offense. So while Russia continues to add 14 to 15,000 men per month that they're recruiting, while they continue to build all these weapon systems and refurbish tanks, all this stuff, they can do that for years. Putin has no problem. He's going to be reelected next month. It's not even a question, actually, because he's very popular within Russia, and people see he's on the upside. They can see that things are trending in their direction. So there's very little they won't be able to support for the indefinite future. Ukraine doesn't have that much time. So what the U.S. should do is recognizing the situation where we're in, and if NATO can't come to this conclusion on its own, then we need to insist that they do the same thing and say, listen, this can't be won militarily. We're going to provide some weapons and some ammunition to the Ukraine side to stop the onslaught of the Russians, to help build defenses, to give them defensive arms, to make any kind of advance by the Russians very painful, and simultaneously starting negotiation with the Kremlin. I get it. You hate Putin. You hate what the Russians have done because they invaded the country. There's thousands of Ukrainian citizens that were killed, that were murdered. It's a terrible thing. No question about it. But what the question does matter, the question that we have to ask ourselves is, in the desire for Ukraine to win and Russia to lose? Are we going to continue to blind ourselves? Just put the blinders on and not be willing to look at reality on the ground. If there's anything this channel has always been about, and everything I've been about in my entire professional career, it's what is the reality on the ground? What is possible? Let's push the envelope as far as we can to succeed as best we can for America. But it has to be based on reality. It can't be based on fantasy. And right now, it's fantasy. And who's paying that price? The Ukraine side is. Ukraine cities are getting wiped off the face of the map, literally. Ukraine, hundreds of thousands have been killed. Probably beyond 1 million have been wounded. Many of them have lost limbs. So many that we can't even count yet have PTSD, and there's no services for them. They just aren't equipped on that side to handle that kind of problem. And that's something that's going to be building up for a long time. You see, their men are terrified to be mobilized, and people are grabbing them off the streets. The population is terrified, and especially the closer you get to the line of contact, because they're afraid they could be next. Why subject them to something that cannot be won? I've been saying this since before the war started, and I've said it for now 2 full years, and it's playing out on the ground like that. Not because I'm some brilliant analyst, but because I'm willing to see things as they are. And I care immensely for the population of Ukraine. I bet I care far more than the David Petraeuses and all these other people who are constantly advocating for more war. Ben Hodges, who always wants to give false hope to the people. It's not based on reality. He harms the people of Ukraine. They harm the population. They don't help it. It's time for us to genuinely put forth the needs of the Ukrainian people, to genuinely take care of our own national security interest, and bring this war to a close before any more people are pointlessly killed. That is your deep dive for today. We thank you for joining us. We're going to continue to track this because this is obviously a very dynamic situation, both in U.S. Congress as well as in NATO, as well as on the front lines there. And we're going to keep bringing it to you because we're unintimidated and uncompromised. I don't care if people like this message. I don't care if they like to hear these things that make it clear that Ukraine is not going to win. We are unintimidated and going to bring you the truth because it's the truth. You deserve the truth, and we're going to keep giving it to you. Join us today at 4 o'clock because we're going to talk about the other issue that's real hot right now, in that Alexander Navalny, the Russian dissident who died in prison under very strange circumstances here. But we're going to show you that some of the reaction from the West is not quite as honest as it may appear. And there's some problems with that. We're going to get into something with Scott Horton later on. You're going to want to tune in for that. Navalny dies there in prison. You'll see that. Join us at 4 p.m. Eastern time, and we will see you on the next episode of Daniel Davis Deep Dive.